The year is 1944. A Japanese soldier stands trembling before his own officers, unable to hear the orders being screamed into his face. They laugh. They mock him. They call him a coward. But when an American nurse examines this prisoner of war months later, she discovers something that will expose one of the darkest truths about the Imperial Japanese Army, and prove that sometimes the enemy's cruelty toward their own soldiers was far worse than anything they faced in battle. Private Isamu Nakahara had survived hell on earth. At 19 years old, he'd been stationed on Saipan when American forces launched their assault in June 1944. The artillery barrage was unlike anything the young soldier had imagined. Shells screamed from naval guns offshore, each explosion closer than the last. Then one landed so near that the world went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Completely, terrifyingly silent. Isamu collapsed into the mud, blood trickling from both ears. When he opened his eyes, he saw his comrades shouting, but heard nothing. The ringing that had filled his head for the first few minutes faded into an oppressive void. He touched his ears. His fingers came away red. He tried to stand, stumbled, fell again. His balance was gone. His hearing was gone. But the battle wasn't. Around him, men ran, fired, died. He couldn't hear the gunfire, couldn't hear the screams. He watched mouths open in agony, but the world remained muted, as if he were watching a silent film of his own nightmare. For 3 days, Isamu wandered through the chaos of Saipan's collapse, following other soldiers by sight alone, trying desperately to understand what was happening through gestures and lip movements he couldn't fully comprehend. When a sergeant grabbed him and shoved him toward a truck, he had no idea where they were going. He only knew that the Americans were winning, and the Japanese were retreating into the island's interior. That's when his real nightmare began. In a makeshift command post dug into a hillside, Colonel Saburo Fujimori was trying to maintain order among the remnants of his shattered battalion. The colonel was old guard Imperial Army, a man who'd fought in Manchuria and believed absolutely in the code of Bushido. To him, surrender was worse than death, and weakness was unforgivable. When Isamu was brought before him with a group of other soldiers for reassignment, the colonel barked orders. The other men snapped to attention and responded. Isamu just stood there, staring blankly. He hadn't heard a word. Fujimori's face darkened. He stepped closer and shouted directly into Isamu's face. Still nothing. No reaction, no response. The young private simply looked confused and frightened. One of the other officers laughed nervously. Fujimori's hand shot out and struck Isamu across the face. The private stumbled but still didn't speak, didn't explain. How could he? He didn't even know he was being addressed. To the colonel, this was insubordination of the highest order. In front of the other men, Fujimori began to mock him, called him defective, weak, a disgrace to the emperor. The other officers joined in the laughter. Some of the enlisted men looked away, uncomfortable but too afraid to speak. Isamu saw their faces, saw the contempt and amusement, but couldn't understand why. He tried to bow, tried to show respect, but that only made them laugh harder. Over the following days, as the Japanese forces retreated deeper into Saipan's caves and ravines, Isamu became the unit's scapegoat. Every order he failed to follow resulted in punishment. Every time he didn't respond quickly enough, he was beaten or denied food. He tried desperately to explain, pointing to his ears, shaking his head, but his attempts at communication were interpreted as excuses. Cowardice. In the Imperial Army's brutal hierarchy, there was no room for weakness, no understanding of invisible wounds. Physical disability was seen as moral failure. Isamu was trapped in a nightmare where he was being punished for something he couldn't control, couldn't fix, couldn't even properly explain. When American forces finally overran their position in early July, Isamu was almost relieved to be captured. At least the beatings would stop. At least he wouldn't have to face Colonel Fujimori's contempt every day. The Americans zip-tied the prisoners' hands and loaded them onto trucks. Isamu watched the other POWs carefully, mimicking their actions, trying not to draw attention. But Colonel Fujimori was also captured, along with several other officers from the unit. And even in captivity, the colonel's disdain for Isamu didn't diminish. During the initial processing at a temporary POW camp on Saipan, the prisoners were lined up for basic interrogation. An interpreter, a Nisei soldier named Captain Elwood Matsumoto, went down the line asking names, ranks, and units. Most prisoners answered reluctantly, giving only name and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention. When Matsumoto reached Isamu, the young private just stared at him, uncomprehending. Matsumoto repeated the question. Nothing. He stepped closer, spoke louder. Still nothing. From further down the line, Colonel Fujimori called out something in Japanese. Matsumoto turned. The colonel was smirking, speaking rapidly. Matsumoto's expression shifted from confusion to disgust as he listened. The colonel was explaining, in mocking tones, that this particular soldier was defective, useless, had refused to follow orders, and was probably feigning his condition to avoid duty. Other Japanese prisoners nodded or looked away. Some seemed uncomfortable with the colonel's words, but none contradicted him. Matsumoto looked back at Isamu with new suspicion. Was this kid really pretending? Trying to game the system? It wouldn't be the first time a prisoner tried to fake illness to get better treatment. He made a note on his clipboard and moved on. Isamu was marked as potentially problematic. Over the next 2 weeks, Isamu was transferred with other POWs to a larger facility on Guadalcanal, then eventually to a hospital ship bound for a stateside POW processing center. Throughout the journey, he remained quiet, withdrawn, watching everything with frightened eyes. Other prisoners avoided him. The stigma that Colonel Fujimori had attached to him followed like a shadow. Even among fellow POWs, he was isolated. When the ship arrived at a military port in California, the prisoners were sorted by medical need. Most went directly to POW camps. But Isamu, along with several others who showed signs of injury or illness, was sent to a military hospital for evaluation. That's where he met Lieutenant Nurse Cordelia Ashford. Cora, as her friends called her, was a veteran of 3 years in the Pacific Theater. She'd served in field hospitals on Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines. She'd seen everything: shrapnel wounds, tropical diseases, psychological trauma, burns, amputations. She'd held dying boys' hands and written letters to their mothers. She'd learned to see past uniforms and flags to the broken human beings underneath. When she was rotated stateside for a rest posting, she'd requested assignment to the POW ward. Some of her colleagues thought she was crazy. Why would anyone volunteer to care for enemy soldiers? But Cora had seen enough suffering to know that pain didn't have a nationality. On a warm September morning, Cora was assigned to conduct initial medical assessments on a new group of Japanese POWs. She worked her way down the ward with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, looking for obvious injuries or illnesses, making notes for the doctors. When she reached Isamu's bed, she found a thin young man sitting rigidly upright, staring straight ahead with an expression of barely contained fear. She smiled gently and spoke in English. No response. She tried again, a bit louder, thinking maybe he was just nervous. Nothing. Not even a glance in her direction. Cora frowned. She'd seen this before with some prisoners, a kind of dissociative state brought on by trauma. But something felt different here. She stepped directly into his line of sight and waved. Isamu's eyes snapped to her face and he immediately tried to stand and bow, nearly falling in his haste. Cora gently pressed him back down onto the bed. She pointed to herself and said her name slowly, then pointed to him with a questioning expression. Isamu's lips moved, forming words, but his voice was strange, flat, like someone who couldn't hear themselves speak. He said his name, but the pronunciation was off, slurred. Cora's instincts kicked in. She'd seen head trauma cases before. She held up one finger in front of his face, making sure he was watching, then moved her hand to the right, out of his line of sight. She snapped her fingers loudly. No reaction. She did it again on the left side. Nothing. She stepped behind him and clapped her hands sharply. Isamu didn't flinch, didn't turn. Cora's expression hardened. She walked quickly to the nurse's station and grabbed an otoscope, then returned to Isamu's bed. She gestured for him to tilt his head. He looked confused but complied. When she examined his ears, what she saw made her stomach turn. Severe scarring in both ear canals. The eardrums were damaged, possibly ruptured and poorly healed. There were signs of old infection. This wasn't recent trauma. This had happened months ago, maybe longer, and had never been treated. Cora stood back, her mind racing. This young man was profoundly deaf. Probably had been since sometime during the battle. And nobody had noticed? Nobody had cared? She thought about the notes in his file. Uncooperative, possible malingering, disciplinary issues. She felt a cold anger building in her chest. She called over Captain Matsumoto, who was working as a translator in the hospital. When he arrived, she explained what she'd found. Matsumoto looked skeptical. He told her about Colonel Fujimori's assessment, about how the kid had been a discipline problem in his unit, how even his own officers thought he was faking. Cora's voice was ice. She asked Matsumoto to bring Colonel Fujimori to the ward. Now. Matsumoto hesitated, then complied. 20 minutes later, Colonel Fujimori was escorted into the ward by 2 MPs. Even in his POW uniform, he carried himself with arrogant dignity. When he saw Isamu, his lip curled in contempt. Matsumoto explained that the nurse wanted to ask him some questions about Private Nakahara. Fujimori waved dismissively and launched into the same speech he'd given before. The private was weak, disobedient, a coward who refused orders. Cora listened through the translation, her expression unreadable. When the colonel finished, she asked a single question through Matsumoto. When did Private Nakahara start refusing orders? Fujimori thought for a moment. After the American bombardment began on Saipan, early June. Cora nodded slowly. She asked another question. Did the colonel notice any injuries to Nakahara around that time? Fujimori shrugged. Many men were injured. It was war. That wasn't an excuse for disobedience. Cora stepped closer to the colonel, close enough that the MPs tensed, ready to intervene. She spoke clearly, waiting for Matsumoto to translate each sentence. Private Nakahara is profoundly deaf. Both eardrums are severely damaged, likely from artillery blast. This injury occurred months ago and was never treated. He cannot hear orders. He cannot hear anything. He wasn't disobeying you. He literally could not hear you. The colonel's face went blank. For a long moment he just stared at Cora, then at Isamu. Matsumoto translated her words again, making sure the colonel understood. Other Japanese POWs in nearby beds had gone quiet. Listening, Cora continued, her voice hard. You punished this soldier for being wounded. You mocked him for a combat injury. You called him a coward when he was deaf from defending your position. The translation hung in the air. Colonel Fujimori's face began to change, the arrogance draining away, replaced by something else. Not quite shame, but a kind of shocked realization. He opened his mouth, closed it, started to speak, stopped. One of the other Japanese prisoners, a sergeant who'd been in Fujimori's unit, suddenly spoke up. Matsumoto translated. The sergeant said he'd seen Nakahara after the bombardment, seen him bleeding from the ears, stumbling. He'd thought the boy was just dazed. He hadn't realized. None of them had realized. Another prisoner added that Nakahara had tried to explain, pointing to his ears, but they'd thought he was making excuses. In the rigid world of the Imperial Army, where showing weakness could get you killed, where officers ruled with absolute authority, and soldiers were expected to endure anything without complaint, the idea that someone might have a legitimate medical condition that prevented them from following orders simply hadn't registered. It was outside their framework of understanding. Disability was weakness. Weakness was shameful, and shame was unforgivable. Cora turned back to Isamu, who was watching the exchange with growing confusion and fear. She gently touched his shoulder and smiled, trying to communicate reassurance. She wrote something on a piece of paper and showed it to Captain Matsumoto, asking him to translate it into Japanese characters. Matsumoto wrote quickly, then handed the paper to Isamu. The young man read it, and his expression crumbled. Tears began streaming down his face. The note said, "You are not a coward. You were hurt. We understand now. You are safe." For months, Isamu had lived in a nightmare of confusion and punishment, unable to understand why everyone hated him, why he kept failing at tasks he didn't know he was being asked to do. He'd internalized the shame, believed that something was fundamentally broken in him beyond the physical. And now, for the first time since that artillery shell had stolen his hearing, someone understood. Someone saw him as a wounded soldier rather than a defective one. Cora made detailed notes in his file, striking through the previous assessments. She ordered a full audiological evaluation and recommended Isamu be transferred to a specialized ward for patients with sensory disabilities. She also filed a formal report about the treatment he'd received from his own officers. Major Roscoe Pemberton, the intelligence officer overseeing POW operations at the facility, was initially skeptical when Cora brought him the case. He'd seen plenty of prisoners try to game the system, and he didn't want to be made a fool of. But Cora was insistent. She brought medical evidence. She brought testimony from other prisoners. She brought Captain Matsumoto, who admitted he'd been wrong in his initial assessment. Pemberton reviewed everything, then did something unusual. He ordered a formal investigation into how POWs with disabilities were being treated, both by American forces and by their own officers before capture. What he found disturbed him. There were other cases. A Japanese soldier with severe PTSD who'd been labeled a coward by his unit. Another with an untreated broken hand who'd been beaten for not working fast enough. The Imperial Army's culture of absolute obedience and contempt for weakness had created situations where wounded soldiers were punished rather than treated. And American forces, not understanding the context, had sometimes perpetuated that mistreatment by taking the word of senior Japanese officers at face value. Pemberton's report went up the chain of command and eventually led to changes in how POWs were medically screened. Interpreters were trained to look for signs of disability that might be mistaken for insubordination. Medical staff were instructed to conduct independent assessments rather than relying on information from captured enemy officers. It was a small change in the vast machinery of war, but it mattered. As for Colonel Fujimori, he was transferred to a different facility. But before he left, he did something unexpected. Through Captain Matsumoto, he asked to speak to Isamu one more time. The request was granted, under supervision. The colonel stood before the young private and bowed deeply, formally. It was an apology, the only kind a man like Fujimori could offer. Isamu, watching through eyes that had seen too much, bowed back. It didn't erase the months of suffering. It didn't restore his hearing, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that the cruelty had been wrong. Isamu spent the rest of the war in the POW hospital, learning basic sign language from American staff and other deaf patients. After Japan's surrender, he faced a difficult choice: return to a country that might still see his disability as shameful, or try to build a new life in America. He chose to stay. With help from Cora and Captain Matsumoto, he applied for resettlement. He learned English through written lessons. He found work in a print shop where his deafness wasn't a barrier. He married a Japanese-American woman who'd been held in an internment camp during the war, two survivors of different kinds of imprisonment finding common ground. They had children, grandchildren. He never fully escaped the nightmares, the memories of standing before Colonel Fujimori, while laughter he couldn't hear rained down on him. But he built a life anyway. Cora continued her nursing career, eventually specializing in rehabilitation medicine. She never forgot Isamu's case. It had crystallized something she'd felt throughout the war but hadn't been able to articulate, that the real enemy wasn't soldiers on the other side, but the systems of cruelty and dehumanization that turned suffering into shame. She testified before military medical boards about the need for better screening and treatment of POWs. She trained younger nurses to look beyond the obvious, to question assumptions, to see patients as individuals rather than enemy combatants. In 1952, she received a commendation for her work improving POW medical protocols. She kept the certificate in a drawer and never mentioned it. The story of Private Isamu Nakahara and Colonel Saburo Fujimori became a case study in military medical schools, an example of how cultural assumptions and institutional cruelty can compound the wounds of war. It illustrated the importance of independent medical assessment, the dangers of taking enemy military hierarchies at face value, and the profound difference that one observant, compassionate healthcare worker can make. But more than that, it was a story about visibility, about how easy it is to overlook suffering when it doesn't fit expected patterns, about how cruelty often stems from ignorance rather than malice, though the damage is the same either way, and about how sometimes the most radical act is simply to see someone, truly see them and acknowledge their pain as real. The Imperial Japanese Army's treatment of disabled soldiers wasn't unique to them. Throughout history, military forces have struggled with how to handle troops who can no longer fight, who show invisible wounds, who fail to meet the standard of the ideal warrior. The specific cultural context of Bushido and the Emperor's divine mandate made it particularly harsh, but the underlying problem, the inability to see disability as anything other than failure, has been universal. What made Isamu's story different was Cora, one nurse who looked closer, who questioned the narrative she'd been given, who trusted her own clinical judgment over the assessments of officers and bureaucrats, who saw a frightened, wounded young man instead of a problematic prisoner. In the decades after the war, as more research was done on combat-related hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, and PTSD, the medical community began to understand just how common Isamu's situation had been. Thousands of soldiers on all sides had suffered invisible wounds that were misinterpreted as cowardice, insubordination, or mental weakness. The stigma attached to these conditions prevented proper treatment and caused immeasurable additional suffering. Slowly, painfully, that began to change. The work that people like Cora did in recognizing and documenting these cases helped build the foundation for modern military medicine's approach to traumatic injury and disability. Today, hearing loss from combat is recognized as one of the most common service-related disabilities. Screening protocols exist to identify it early. Treatment options are available. And perhaps most importantly, it's understood as a wound of war, not a character flaw. But that understanding didn't come automatically. It came from individual cases, individual nurses and doctors who looked closer, questioned harder, and insisted that their patients' experiences were real and valid. It came from veterans who spoke up about their own invisible wounds, fighting against stigma and disbelief. And it came from a slow, difficult cultural shift in how we think about disability, strength, and what it means to be a soldier. Private Isamu Nakahara never became famous. His name doesn't appear in history books. There are no monuments to his suffering or survival, but his story, and stories like it, changed how modern militaries understand and treat combat disabilities. That legacy, invisible like his wound, ripples forward through time, touching lives he never knew, preventing suffering he never witnessed. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that history isn't just made by generals and politicians, by grand strategies and decisive battles. It's also made by nurses who look closer, by wounded soldiers who survive despite everything, by small acts of recognition and compassion that challenge systems of cruelty. Colonel Fujimori returned to Japan after the war. He lived quietly, never speaking publicly about his service. But those who knew him said he was changed, less certain, less harsh. Whether that change came from defeat, from captivity, or from the moment an American nurse showed him what he'd been too blind to see, no one could say. Maybe all three. Captain Matsumoto continued working as a translator and cultural liaison, helping with the post-war occupation and rebuilding of Japan. He often thought about that day in the hospital ward, about how close he'd come to dismissing Isamu entirely, trusting the colonel's assessment over his own observations. It made him more careful, more skeptical of authority, more willing to question official narratives. He carried that lesson into his post-war career in diplomacy and education. And Cora? She retired from nursing in 1968, after 25 years of service. She'd seen medicine transform, seen attitudes toward disability and trauma evolve. She'd trained hundreds of younger nurses, always emphasizing the same principles. Look closer, question assumptions, trust your clinical judgment, see the person before the patient. On her last day, cleaning out her locker, she found a letter that had been forwarded through various military channels over the years. It was from Isamu, written in careful English with help from his wife. It thanked her for seeing him when no one else had, for giving him back his dignity, for making it possible for him to build a life. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She never responded. What could she say? She'd simply done her job, the job she'd trained for, the job she believed in. But she kept the letter, and sometimes, on difficult days, she would take it out and read it again, remembering that young frightened soldier in the hospital bed, and the moment when understanding replaced contempt, when compassion broke through the barriers of language and culture and war. That's the real story behind the title. Not just that generals laughed at a deaf POW, not just that an American nurse discovered what they'd missed, but that in the midst of history's most devastating war, in a system designed to dehumanize and destroy, one person's willingness to look closer, to question, to care, created a ripple of change that extended far beyond that single moment. Because that's how progress happens, not in grand declarations or sweeping reforms, though those matter too, but in individual choices, in one nurse deciding to trust her instincts, in one soldier finding the courage to keep living despite unbearable shame. in one interpreter admitting he'd been wrong, in one officer bowing in apology. Small moments of humanity that, accumulated over time, shift the weight of history toward justice. Private Isamu Nakahara died in 1987, at the age of 62. He was buried in a small cemetery in California, his gravestone bearing both his Japanese name and the American name he'd adopted. His children and grandchildren stood at the grave, 3 generations shaped by his survival. At the service, his daughter read a letter her father had written near the end of his life, meant to be shared after his death. In it, he described the moment in the hospital when he'd finally understood that he wasn't broken, wasn't a coward, wasn't shameful, when someone had seen his wound as real. He wrote that it had saved his life in a way that went beyond physical survival. It had given him permission to be human again. Cora Ashford died 6 months later, at 73. Her obituary mentioned her military service and her work in rehabilitation medicine. It didn't mention Isamu. She'd never spoken about him publicly, never used his story for her own recognition. But at her funeral, among the flowers and cards from former colleagues and patients, there was one arrangement that stood out. It was from a family with a Japanese name, people no one at the service recognized. The card said simply, "For the nurse who saw what others didn't, with eternal gratitude." Her children didn't understand the reference. They asked around, but no one knew the story. It remained a mystery, a private connection between their mother and some distant family whose lives she'd touched. They kept the card anyway, sensing it was important even if they didn't know why. And that's where the story ends and begins again. Because these weren't isolated incidents. Throughout the war, throughout history, there have been countless moments like this. Suffering invisible to those in power, wounds dismissed as weakness, people reduced to problems, and occasionally, someone who looks closer, who questions, who sees. Most of those moments are lost to history. No records kept, no letters saved, no ripples visible enough to trace. But they happened. They're happening still. In hospitals and camps, in institutions and systems, wherever human beings encounter each other across barriers of power and understanding. The question is always the same. Will we look closer? Will we question our assumptions? Will we see the person in front of us, truly see them? Or will we accept the easy narrative, the official story, the path of least resistance? Private Nakahara and Nurse Ashford give us one answer, not the only answer, but an important one, that it's worth the effort, worth the trouble, worth the risk of being wrong, of challenging authority, of caring when it would be easier not to. Because on the other side of that effort is recognition, dignity, the possibility of healing, and maybe, just maybe, a small shift in how we treat each other, a tiny movement toward a more humane world. The generals laughed because they couldn't see. The nurse saw because she chose to look. And in that choice, in that moment of clarity cutting through the fog of war and prejudice and institutional cruelty, something changed. Not everything, not enough, but something. And sometimes in the darkest moments of history, something is enough to make the difference between despair and hope, between shame and dignity, between a life lost and a life saved. That's the story. That's what happened when one American nurse saw what Japanese generals didn't. Not a miracle, not a dramatic rescue. Just attention, just care, just the simple radical act of seeing another human being suffering as real and worthy of recognition. It doesn't sound like much. But for Private Isamu Nakahara, trembling in a hospital bed in 1944, certain he was broken beyond repair, it was everything. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. History is full of untold stories like this. Moments of humanity in the midst of darkness. Join us as we continue to uncover them.